4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to another installment of the Fragments of Silicon Reviews. 3 games up this week, which usually means one is really, really small and short, but that's up a bit later. First up is a game called Rad Rodgers. Okay, and admittedly, this is going to be probably more closer to impressions than like a full-on review, because I only spent about an hour and a half with the game. Played like the first 2 levels, and the reason was I was getting some pretty poor performance from the game, both in terms of like actually playing in the levels, really choppy gameplay, frame pacing issues, whatnot, which kind of made things really hard to play, and also really, really bad load times. Like the game took about 3-4 minutes to load up, and would take long to get into the level select and all that shit. And my computer is, my laptop is not an unpowerful laptop. It's not top of the range, but I made sure to get a pretty beefy thing. So that's kind of the first thing to keep in mind. Yeah, this game has some pretty high run requirements on the PC. Now, it's also on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. So, yeah, you're going to get greater stability with the console versions. And I can tell you why this game runs, has such high specs. And it's because it's got a lot of graphical effects. Like, if you can see, like, the trailer or screenshots or really anything, you can see that, this game looks pretty visually stunning. Which is kind of odd because the central conceit around Rad Rodgers is this is supposed to be a throwback. Like, it's a it's a throwback platformer to the 90s, and it really isn't. Not in any like specific case.
Yeah, in the thematics and stuff, this is a throwback to like the old Commander Keen games.
Commander Keen, Jackrabbit, the original Duke Nukem, the 2D platformer games, that kind of thing. And even then, I'd say the game it has most in common with thematically is Conker's Bad Fur Day, which isn't even a 90s platformer. That came out in 2001. And so and I'll also note it's not using things like a CGA art style or PC speaker sounds, thank God.
The character designs are a little bit like that, but not super.
Yeah.
And while you're supposed to have kind of an old game console as your partner, who's kind of, I think he's a little on the Falma side, it's like an old PlayStation 1, so
yeah, that's
not quite the era that the game is harkening back to.
Yeah, that's getting even further away because console platformers were not designed like this, like ever. Because what I did play, this game has some pretty huge and sprawling levels, which is definitely more a mark of PC platformers. Like usually, like the part time on the first level is 12 minutes. that's not like console levels usually weren't that big. PC, yeah. PC like PC platforming games from the early 90s, those were definitely sprawling affairs with a lot of items to collect and hidden things to find. And yeah, there are hidden, you know, there are various hidden gems and shit to find, and a lot of collectibles. It's got some FPS DNA here as well. Mostly in terms like the attitude, like the select screen of the difficulty mirrors that of like Wolfenstein 3D or Doom, or, and that kind of makes sense because the developer of the game, Slipgate Studios, is the former Interceptor Entertainment, which did the Rise of the Triad remake. Anyway, going back to the visuals, I made this comparison in the writers' room last week. They remind me more of Trine or the Great Gianna Sisters reboot than anything from the '90s, because not just in terms of fidelity, unfortunately, it's got that busyness to it that I've never quite liked in the Trine games. Like, yeah, there's a lot of shit going on, but it's also, there's a lot of shit going on. I'm not exactly sure what is an enemy or not. That popped up more than once. Now, in terms of actual platforming, yeah, I'm like, I'd say closest to say Duke Nukem or Jazz Jackrabbit. Words can be said well. Or rather, something like Metal Slug or Contra. Maybe a bit odd to bring into this conversation, but that's because this is a running gun, in addition to being a platformer. Like, you know, your primary weapon is a machine gun, and you use that in pretty like. I'm trying to think of the comparison here. Like, you know, the gameplay isn't exactly like Metal Slug or Contra. You know, it's not that fast paced.
A little more deliberate, or
yeah, something like that. Like, I'm not exactly placing the like the gameplay style. Like, really, Duke Nukem 1 or 2 is the frame of reference you should be looking at here. Like, and the thing of it is, even though I haven't played a lot of it, I didn't really need to, because from what I've seen, from what I've researched, if you played one level, you've played them all. Like the game seems to be beset with a lack of variety. Now, which was also kind of a feature of platformers back in the day. But it anyway, I can't, outside of the performance issues, I can't say I really like the gameplay itself. The jumping felt very loose and slippery. Like there was a lot of times when I just slip off a platform.
That's never good.
Yeah, like, and that's kind of important when you're a platformer. Even in a looser sense of the word. Like, let's see. The action is broken up by these gameplay segments. So the plot is you are Rad Rodgers. You are drawn into a video game, and that's why your console's alive, and you're trying to get out. Could be a dream, like, and anyway, another sign of modernization. This game has very, self-referential humor, which once again really wasn't a thing of the '90s. Like, Conker did that.
Yeah.
really
you can't joke about a thing as much when the thing is still being done seriously.
It's not really being done seriously though.
No, I mean, but like in the original Commander Keen and Duke Nukem and stuff, it was not really an ironic sort of game.
No. Like I said, it's weird, but yeah, like one of the main inspirations was definitely Conquer here. Just in terms of tone, in terms of level of violence, like you can turn it off, but there is a level, you can have blood explosions and shit, which that was the thing in like FPS games or certain fighters or what have you. Not really the platforming sets. I'm sure there might have been a platformer or two that did it, but nobody paid attention. Like, nobody really tried that until Conquer, and its humor is derived from, like, so much of this is derived from Conquer. It's pretty unreal, actually. Like, except it doesn't really have the charm of Conquer. Just another odd saying. Like,
I was gonna say that's kind of saying something. Conquer isn't exactly known for its ridiculous amounts of charm.
well, it's like, remember, Conquer did have a lot of British wit behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Rare was pretty good at that kind of humor. Yeah, there's none of that here. Like, it's a lot more really modern in the fact that it's crass and gross and all that shit. That, really trying to be actually funny. Anyway, the soundtrack is another curio, as it's got a really good soundtrack, but it's, once again, not really fitting the era. It's new wave retro stuff, 80s synthwave. Good stuff, but not really what you found in platformers, really anything of the 90s. Like, 90s was pretty hostile to synthwave. Like, oh right, getting back to my the gameplay segments are like, you've got these little segments where you go through top-down perspective, these like glitch areas, where you have to find like a piece of scenery or something like that, and that's where the whole breaking the fourth wall humor comes from, or at least one of the bits. And yeah, that's really all I have to say about this game. Like I said, this is veering more towards impressions because, well, A, I couldn't get the game to run all that well, and B, we only got one code, so only one of us could play the game. This is the danger when we only get one code.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have had it performing much better, but I was at least a little bit interested in playing this. It seems kind of interesting, but
yeah, and it clocks in at $20, which is a perfectly fine price point. For because this is a full retail title. There are actually two versions of this game. There's this, and there's the previous version, which was called World 1, which is just literally the first world. Yeah, I believe I'm trying to like, I think there's about 8 levels, like 3 worlds kind of deal. So for a 2D platformer, it's pretty packed. Like, don't. Oh, and right, your overall goal in each level is to find 4 pieces of talisman to open up the door.
not just get to the end.
Yes. If you get to the end, you're going to find a locked door. Once again, that's very 90s PC platform.
Yeah.
There are elements of that design here. It's just, it's not as much as a throwback as it thinks it is, in a lot of regards. And in other areas, it's a throwback to not the proper area. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're looking like And also, there are bonus levels called Pogo challenges. That's Commander Keen, because Commander Keen's main like distinguishing gimmick was the Pogo stick. So it does make for an interesting melting pot here, but I can't say I could really recommend it to enthusiasts of that era. Personally, the early 90s PC platforming era is not one I mourn because, God's honest truth, most of those platformers sucked. You know, I will say, yeah, the Jazz Jackrapids and the Commander Keens, sure, those were fine, but there were a lot of Apogee platformers that weren't that good. Like, I'm looking at you, Monuments of Mars or Secret Agent.
I have somewhat fond memories of Monuments of Mars, even though I know it was not actually very good.
Yeah. Or like Pharaoh's Tomb. Oh, geez, that. And so on and so forth. And let's see. Ultimately, I give this a solid recommendation, provided you can run it properly. Just, it may not be what you think it is. And yeah, if you're looking for, say, Conquer, yeah, you're going to get the humor, but you're not going to get like the gameplay. It's a collectathon, but it's in 2D. And yes, that extra dimension does make a huge difference. It's literally it's literally an extra dimension of gameplay, and but it's definitely in the spirit of Rare's collectathons. Now, whether or not you see that as a good thing is going to depend on you, because there are actually a lot of people who don't like Rare's platformers for that reason. Anyway, yeah, once again, apologies for this being kind of light in terms of in-depth critical analysis, but sometimes we are hampered by our experience with the game directly, and this is one of those times. And yet we still have to review this because we have an obligation to fulfill. Mm-hmm. So we soldier on best we can. Be sure to tune in after a short break. We'll do Guppy, and then we'll take the long break. So, good gaming and such.